galaxy was vast, filled with billions of stars and countless worlds. But in that darkness, war had come. Humanity had not wanted this fight. For generations, they had expanded slowly, building colonies across nearby systems, creating fleets to protect their people. Those fleets had stood strong against pirates, against rebellions, and against small conflicts. But when the enemy came, everything changed. The aliens did not come as explorers or traders. They came as conquerors. Their ships were massive, dark shadows that swallowed the light of suns as they entered human space. They moved with precision, striking colony after colony, burning defenses, and leaving nothing behind but silence. Humanity's fleets rose to fight them, proud and determined, but each time, the result was the same: total defeat. The first fleet was stationed near the colony of Helios Prime. It had 100 warships, sleek destroyers and heavy cruisers, led by 2 dreadnoughts. When the aliens arrived, the sky turned into a storm of fire. For hours, humanity fought bravely, missiles tearing through the blackness, plasma beams cutting across the void. But the enemy had technology far beyond what humans had ever seen. Shields that absorbed every strike, weapons that could split ships apart with a single shot, and coordination so perfect that it seemed like one mind was commanding them all. By the end of the battle, nothing remained. 100 ships were gone, reduced to drifting wrecks or silent flames. Helios Prime itself was left defenseless, its people at the mercy of the invaders. The news spread fast. Panic rippled across the colonies, but humanity refused to bow. The second fleet launched from Mars, a massive formation meant to be the pride of Earth. Families watched from spaceports as their loved ones left, waving through glass windows, believing they would return as heroes. But the enemy was waiting. The fleet barely crossed into the next system before it was ambushed. Trapped between 2 enemy groups, the second fleet fought desperately, but their ships were cut down one by one. When Mars received the final transmission, it was filled with static, screams, and then silence. One by one, every fleet tried to hold the line. The third fleet was shattered over Titan's orbit. The fourth fought near the gas giant Klyros, its wreckage now floating like a graveyard around the planet. The fifth, the sixth, the seventh, each destroyed in turn. Each commander believed they could find a weakness in the enemy. Each crew swore they would protect humanity. And each time, the invaders crushed them with terrifying ease. It wasn't only the fleets that suffered. Colonies burned. Entire worlds went dark. Families who had built their homes under distant suns were erased in hours. The enemy was not merciful. They wanted no survivors, no chance for humanity to rise again. Billions watched helplessly as the stars they once called safe turned into battlefields. On Earth, fear spread like wildfire. Governments argued, leaders shouted, but no one had answers. The fleets were gone, the colonies falling one after another. Humanity was losing faster than anyone had imagined. For the first time in centuries, people whispered words they thought they had forgotten. Extinction, annihilation, the end. And yet, even as despair grew, something else stirred beneath it. Anger, grief, a quiet, burning refusal to accept defeat. Across the remaining bases and surviving ships, stories began to circulate. Tales of captains who fought to the last breath, of crews who rammed their ships into the enemy rather than surrender, of colonies that sent out desperate signals before going silent. Humanity was being broken, yes, but not without leaving scars on the enemy. Still, the truth was clear. The fleets had fallen. Every defense humanity had built over centuries was gone in a matter of weeks. The alien armadas moved like storms across human space, and nothing seemed strong enough to stop them. The galaxy watched, and most believed it was only a matter of time before humanity itself vanished. Among the survivors, however, whispers began to spread about one ship. A dreadnought that had not yet fallen. A ship that had faced the enemy more than once and somehow still lived to tell the tale. No one knew how long it could last, or if it truly had the power to turn the tide. But in a galaxy drowning in despair, even a single surviving warship could become a symbol. The fall of the fleets was not just the loss of ships. It was the shattering of hope, the breaking of pride, the realization that humanity was fighting an enemy far beyond anything it had ever faced. But as long as even one ship remained, there was a chance, small, fragile, but real. And that chance was enough to keep the fire of resistance alive. In the ashes of defeat, when almost every human fleet had been destroyed, there remained one warship that still carried the banner of survival. Her name was Invictus. She was not the newest ship, nor the most advanced, but she was built to endure. Her armor was thick, her cannons powerful, and her heart, the crew who served within, was unbreakable. While others fell, Invictus survived, scarred but alive, drifting like a lone fortress in the dark void. At the center of it all stood Captain Elias Kale. He was not a man of many words, but his presence filled the bridge like gravity itself. Tall, with dark eyes that carried the weight of too many battles, he had been there when the first fleet burned. He had commanded during the desperate retreats, when humanity lost ship after ship. He had listened to the last transmissions of friends, allies, and commanders who never returned. And yet, he remained. The crew of Invictus was no different. They were survivors, each of them carrying memories of families lost, of homes destroyed, of fleets that had been annihilated. There was Lieutenant Rena, the tactical officer whose brother had died aboard the Fourth Fleet. There was Chief Engineer Malik, who worked day and night to keep failing systems alive, even as his own colony was turned to ash. And there was young Ensign Dorian, barely 20, who had joined the Navy dreaming of adventure, only to find himself standing on the last ship humanity had left. Every corridor of Invictus bore the marks of survival. Scars across the hull from enemy plasma fire. Entire sections sealed off, airless and dark. Engines that coughed and groaned, yet still carried the ship forward. Supplies were low, rations thin, and the medical bay overflowed with wounded. But no one abandoned their posts. Each crew member knew that if Invictus fell, there might be nothing left of humanity's resistance. The dreadnought had not escaped battle untested. Twice already she had faced the alien armadas, and twice she had crawled out from the wreckage, bloodied but unbroken. In one fight, she had destroyed 3 enemy cruisers before slipping into a nebula, vanishing like a ghost. In another, she had defended a convoy of civilian transports, buying them just enough time to escape before being chased into the void. These victories were small compared to the size of the enemy, but they carried meaning. For every colonist who reached safety, for every survivor who whispered the name Invictus, hope flickered where once there had been none. But Captain Kale knew the truth. The dreadnought was not invincible. She was one ship against an empire. Each battle wore her down. Each repair stretched her crew thinner. Sooner or later, the enemy would come for them in full force. And yet, Kale refused to let his people see his doubt. On the bridge, his voice was steady, his orders calm. He gave them something they desperately needed, a leader who would never surrender. The galaxy itself began to take notice. Refugees spoke of the human warship that would not fall. Some called it a myth, a story to comfort the desperate. But those who had seen it with their own eyes knew the truth. One dreadnought still roamed the stars, carrying the fire of a fallen species. Even the enemy had begun to recognize her. Alien commanders spoke her name with irritation, with anger, with a faint edge of fear. She had become a thorn in their grand campaign, a single blade standing against an ocean. Life aboard Invictus was not glorious. The crew lived with exhaustion pressing on their bones. Food was rationed to the smallest portions. Repairs meant long nights in freezing maintenance shafts, sparks falling like rain as welders worked in silence. And yet, there was a strange kind of unity among them. They laughed when they could. They shared stories when the darkness seemed too heavy, and they carried each other through the endless days of running and fighting. They were not just a crew anymore, they were a family, bound by survival and the stubborn refusal to die. One night, as the ship drifted through the quiet of a dead system, Kale stood in the observation deck, watching the stars. To most, they were distant lights, cold and unreachable. To him, they were graves. Each star marked a colony lost, a fleet destroyed, a friend gone forever. And yet, as he stood there, He whispered words only he could hear. Not yet. Humanity is not finished yet. The dreadnought became a symbol. A single ship, yes, but one that carried more weight than 1,000. It was proof that humanity, no matter how broken, would not vanish quietly. The crew did not fight only for survival anymore. They fought for legacy, for defiance, for the memory of those who had fallen. They knew the enemy would come again, stronger than before. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew one thing above all else. They would not be the ones to break. And so Invictus sailed on, scarred but proud, a lone titan drifting through the stars. The last dreadnought, the last hope, the ship that refused to fall. Captain Elias Kale sat in the command chair of Invictus, the dim glow of the bridge screens reflecting off his tired face. Around him, his officers worked quietly, each focused on their duties, but every soul aboard the ship felt the same truth. This was no ordinary mission, no ordinary ship. Invictus was the last of her kind, and Kale was the man holding her together. The burden was heavy, heavier than the armor plates bolted to the ship's hull, heavier than the endless stars pressing down on them from all sides. Kale had commanded warships for most of his life, but never under such impossible circumstances. In the past, he had fought alongside entire fleets, secure in the knowledge that reinforcements stood ready. Now there were no reinforcements, no fleet, no backup, only his ship, his crew, and the endless tide of enemies waiting for their chance to finish what they had started. Every order he gave could mean life or death not only for his people, but for the very idea of human resistance. Some nights, when the ship drifted silently through dead space, Kale sat alone in his quarters, staring at the names on a small datapad. Names of captains he had known, friends who had commanded fleets now gone. He remembered the last transmissions, the static-filled voices shouting orders before being swallowed by silence. He remembered the cries for help from colonies as they burned. And worst of all, he remembered that he could do nothing to save them. The ghosts of the fallen pressed in on him, demanding answers he did not have. But Kale never showed that weight to his crew. On the bridge, he was calm, steady, unshakable. His eyes never wavered. His voice never broke. He carried their fear so they didn't have to. To the officers, he was a rock in a storm. To the youngest ensigns, he was proof that they could keep fighting even when the galaxy turned against them. In truth, he doubted himself every day, but a captain could not afford doubt. His duty was not just to fight battles, it was to give his people something to believe in. The crew of Invictus understood his burden more than he thought. They saw the lines deepening on his face, the nights he refused to sleep, the way he lingered in silence before giving a final order in battle. They knew the cost of command, yet they trusted him completely. When Kale told them to hold, they held. When he told them to fight, they fought with every ounce of strength left in their bodies. They did not need long speeches. His presence was enough. Still, there were moments when the weight became almost unbearable. During one battle, Invictus had defended a small convoy of transports fleeing from a ruined colony. The enemy came hard, faster, and stronger than expected. Kale had a choice: order the transports to scatter, saving some but sacrificing the rest, or stay and fight to protect them all, risking his ship in the process. He chose to stay. The battle was brutal, the dreadnought taking hit after hit, hull plates tearing open, alarms screaming across the decks. But the transports escaped, every one of them. Later, as Kale walked through the medbay, seeing his injured crew lying pale and broken, he wondered if he had made the right decision. He had saved thousands of lives on the transports, but at the cost of dozens of his own crew. That was the cruel weight of command. Every victory came with blood. At times, he envied his crew. They carried pain, yes, but their tasks were clear. The engineer fixed engines. The gunner fired cannons. The pilot flew the ship. Their duty ended with their shift. But Kale never escaped his. Even when he closed his eyes, the decisions followed him, haunting his dreams. He could not lay down the burden, not even for a moment, because if he faltered, the last light of humanity might falter with him. There was a night when Ensign Dorian, the youngest aboard, found Kale standing in the observation deck. The stars stretched endlessly before them, cold and silent. Dorian hesitated, then asked softly, "Captain, do you ever think we'll lose?" Kale looked at the boy, saw the fear in his eyes, and for a moment, the true answer pressed on his tongue. But he swallowed it, pushed it down, and instead said, "We may lose battles, we may lose ships, but as long as even one of us still fights, humanity has not lost. Remember that." Those words spread through the crew like fire, repeated in whispers, carried like a shield against despair. Kale gave them hope, even when he struggled to hold it himself. The enemy saw only a single ship, drifting stubbornly through the void. What they did not understand was that Invictus was more than steel and guns. She was a symbol, and Kale was the man carrying that symbol on his shoulders, no matter how heavy it became. His choices shaped not only the fate of his crew but the future of humanity. The burden was crushing, but he bore it in silence, step by step, day by day. And deep inside, even under the crushing weight, Elias Kale held on to one simple truth: humanity was not finished. As long as his ship drew breath, as long as his crew stood ready, the fight would go on. He would carry the ghosts, the pain, the doubt, but he would not break. Because a captain did not have the luxury of breaking, not when he commanded the last dreadnought of humankind. The silence of space ended with the warning alarms. On the bridge of Invictus, red lights flashed, and the crew stiffened as sensors picked up movement in the distance. The enemy had found them. Captain Elias Kale leaned forward in his chair, his dark eyes narrowing as the tactical screen filled with red markers. 5 ships moving fast, sweeping through the system like hunters. They weren't the largest fleet humanity had seen, but still more than enough to crush a lone dreadnought. No one on the bridge spoke. They didn't need to. They all knew what was coming. Kale finally broke the silence. Battle stations. Lock down all compartments. Ready all weapons. His voice was steady, calm. The voice of a man who had faced this before. That calm steadiness spread through the crew, pulling them back from the edge of fear. Across the ship, alarms blared. Crew rushed to their stations. Engineers sealed off damaged sections. Gunners warmed up the massive cannons. The dreadnought came alive, her engines rumbling like a beast preparing to strike. For a moment, Invictus was no longer a battered survivor. It was a warship, forged for this very purpose. The enemy ships approached, confident, fast, certain of their victory. To them, Invictus was just one more target, another piece of human steel to be torn apart and left drifting in silence. But Kale had no intention of letting them have an easy kill. He stood slowly from his chair, stepping closer to the main screen, and gave the order that would mark the beginning of the battle. Open fire. The first barrage shook the ship, the recoil echoing through the hull as the main cannons unleashed their fury. Beams of plasma and trails of missiles streaked through the void, lighting up the darkness like falling stars. One of the enemy cruisers took a direct hit, its shields flaring, then cracking. The crew of Invictus erupted in cheers, but Kale did not smile. He knew it wasn't victory. It was only the beginning. The aliens fired back. Their weapons were monstrous, tearing through space with blasts of energy that could shatter mountains. Invictus rocked violently, alarms screaming as hull plating was scorched and torn. Sparks flew across the bridge, but no one flinched. They had been here before, and they knew fear was useless. Damage report, Kale demanded. Minor breaches in Sector 12. Fires contained. Weapons still online, the officer replied. Kale nodded once. Then hit them harder. What followed was chaos wrapped in order. Every gun on the dreadnought roared, missiles streaking out like lightning bolts, smaller turrets hammering at enemy fighters that swarmed in waves. The enemy pressed hard, but Kale countered with precision. He didn't waste shots. He didn't panic. Every strike was calculated, every move designed to hurt the enemy in ways they didn't expect. At one point, the tactical officer shouted, "3 ships closing in from the left flank." Kale's mind raced. They wanted to box him in, force him into a trap. Instead of retreating, he ordered something no one expected. Turn into them. Full thrust. Bring the forward batteries online. The crew obeyed, though their hearts pounded. The dreadnought swung sharply, engines blazing, charging directly at the enemy like a beast baring its teeth. The move shocked the aliens. They had expected retreat, not defiance. Before they could adjust, Invictus unleashed another barrage, tearing into the lead ship at point-blank range. The explosion lit the void, debris scattering across the stars. The dreadnought roared past the wreckage, scarred but alive. Cheers erupted again, louder this time, filled with hope. For the first time, the enemy knew fear. But the fight was not over. The remaining ships regrouped, circling, hammering the dreadnought with relentless fire. Hull plates buckled, systems flickered, medbays filled with wounded. Yet Invictus refused to stop. Gunners fought through smoke-filled decks. Engineers worked with blood on their hands. Pilots maneuvered the great ship through impossible angles. Every man and woman aboard gave everything they had, because they knew what was at stake. Finally, after what felt like hours, the tide turned. Another enemy ship went down in flames. Then another. The last two retreated, limping away into the darkness, unwilling to face the wrath of the lone dreadnought. When the sensors cleared, silence returned to the bridge. The crew sat in stunned quiet, their chests heaving, their hands trembling. Against all odds, they had survived again. Captain Cale stood among them, steady as ever, though inside he carried the same exhaustion, the same relief. He looked around at his crew. The soot on their faces, the blood on their uniforms, the determination in their eyes, and he felt a quiet pride. They were not just survivors. They were fighters. And together they had done what no one else believed possible. The news spread quickly. Rumors whispered from ship to ship, colony to colony. The dreadnought Invictus had stood alone against the alien fleet and lived. For humanity, broken and scattered, it was more than a story. It was hope. If one ship could fight back, then maybe humanity was not finished. As the crew began repairs, patching wounds both on the ship and in themselves, Cale allowed himself one moment of quiet thought. The enemy would return. Next time it would be worse. But he also knew this. Invictus had shown the galaxy that humans were not so easy to destroy. And as long as one ship, one crew, and one captain stood against the storm, humanity would never fall in silence. The battle was over, but the echoes of it still clung to Invictus. The ship limped through the void, her hull scarred, her engines groaning, and the smell of smoke still clinging to her decks. The crew was exhausted, their uniforms stained with sweat and ash, their bodies aching from hours of fighting. Yet, despite all the pain, there was something new in their eyes, something that had been missing for weeks. It was hope. Word spread faster than fire through dry grass. Refugees fleeing ruined colonies whispered the story. A single human dreadnought had faced the enemy and survived. Pilots, engineers, and families scattered across the stars passed the tale from mouth to mouth, from station to station. They called it a miracle, though those aboard Invictus knew it had not been a miracle at all. It had been blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Still, the story grew bigger with each telling, turning one battle into legend. For the first time since the war began, humanity had a symbol. Invictus was no longer just a ship, it was a beacon. People who had once spoken only of surrender or escape now dared to imagine resistance. Cale heard the transmissions himself. Desperate voices thanking him, calling him a hero, begging him to keep fighting. He did not think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as a tired man doing his duty. But he knew symbols mattered more than truth. And if his ship gave humanity something to believe in, then he would bear that role no matter how heavy it became. But victories carried costs. The medbay overflowed with wounded, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and blood. Some crew members would never rise again, their names added to the growing list Cale carried in his datapad. Each name carved into his heart like a scar. The engineers worked around the clock, welding broken hull plates, coaxing life back into failing systems. Supplies ran dangerously low. Rations were cut again, portions shrinking until meals were little more than survival. The ship lived, but she bled with every breath. Kale stood in the war room, staring at the galaxy map. Red markers stretched across human space, showing the vast reach of the enemy. Human-controlled systems were dwindling, colonies falling one after another. Against such overwhelming force, Invictus was a grain of sand in a storm. And yet, that grain had caught the galaxy's attention. He knew the enemy would not ignore them anymore. They would come harder, stronger, determined to crush the one spark of resistance before it grew into a fire. Still, Invictus continued her mission. She moved from system to system, striking when she could, rescuing survivors, disrupting supply lines. Each time she appeared, people cheered. Each time she vanished into the stars, rumors spread that she was everywhere, striking fear into the invaders. Other ships, small and scattered, began to rally around the idea of resistance. Pilots who once ran now fought back in tiny raids, inspired by the dreadnought that refused to die. It wasn't enough to turn the war, but it was enough to remind the galaxy that humanity was not yet finished. Among the crew, there was pride, but also weariness. Every battle stretched them thinner, every repair a gamble. Some whispered their doubts in private, wondering how long they could keep this up. Others refused to speak of weakness, clinging fiercely to the hope they had earned. In quiet moments, laughter returned to the ship, faint and fragile, but real. Even in the darkest corners of space, humanity's stubborn spirit lived on. One night, Kale walked the corridors watching his crew. He saw young Dorian helping repair a turret, grease staining his uniform. He saw Rena hunched over tactical screens, her eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. He saw Malik in engineering, cursing at broken systems while his hands worked with unshakable precision. Each of them carried the same fire, the refusal to give up. Kale felt the burden of his command, but he also felt pride. They were the last line, and they stood unbroken. But the enemy was not blind. Reports showed that alien commanders had begun setting traps, deploying larger fleets to hunt them. They feared what Invictus represented. Not just a ship, but an idea. And ideas were far more dangerous than weapons. If humanity believed they could fight, then the war would drag on. The enemy wanted it ended swiftly, cleanly, which meant they would bring their full strength against him soon. Kale knew this truth, but he did not tell the crew. Instead, he told them only what they needed to hear. We fight because no one else can. We endure because no one else will. Every day we survive, humanity survives. That is enough. His words became a promise, repeated quietly in the hearts of those who served him. The turning point was not just a battle. It was the moment when despair began to fade, replaced by defiance. Invictus had proven that humanity could still fight. And though the enemy would come again, though the road ahead was filled with blood and fire, Kale and his crew knew one thing for certain. They would not be forgotten. Their stand had already changed the galaxy. And as the dreadnought sailed on, scarred but alive, her engines burning against the endless dark, the crew of Invictus carried a new certainty in their hearts. The war was far from over, but neither was humanity. The galaxy was beginning to believe in Invictus. Rumors of the lone dreadnought spread across star systems like wildfire. Refugees spoke her name with reverence. Resistance fighters carried her story like a banner. And even neutral species whispered about the humans who refused to die. But while the broken and scattered found hope, the enemy found only frustration. The invaders had crushed every fleet, burned every colony, and broken every defense. Yet this one ship continued to haunt them, striking where least expected, disappearing before they could bring their full power to bear. For the enemy commanders, it was not just an annoyance, it was a stain on their pride. And pride demanded an answer. That answer came in the form of a trap. Sensors aboard Invictus picked up a distress call, faint but clear. A civilian transport claimed it was under attack in the outer edges of the Myros system. Its engines were failing, its shields collapsing. The crew listened in silence as desperate voices begged for help, promising coordinates, pleading not to be abandoned. Cale stood on the bridge, his jaw tight. He had heard too many cries like this before. Too many times they had arrived too late. He could not let it happen again. "Set course," Cale ordered. "We'll bring them aboard." His crew obeyed without hesitation. They trusted him. They trusted that their captain could pull them through any storm. But as Invictus dropped out of faster-than-light travel into the system, the truth revealed itself. There was no transport, no civilians, no distress beacon, only silence, and then the trap was sprung. The darkness lit up as enemy ships emerged from every angle. Dozens of cruisers, battleships, and carriers. So many that their engines turned the void into a sea of red lights. They formed a circle around the dreadnought, cutting off every path of escape. Cale's crew froze in horror as the tactical screen filled with enemy markers, far more than they had ever faced before. "They were waiting for us," Rena whispered, her voice barely audible. Cale's expression did not change, though inside, he felt the weight of the moment press down like a mountain. This was it. The trap had been set, the noose pulled tight. The galaxy might call Invictus invincible, but Cale knew better. They were one ship against an armada. Survival was no longer guaranteed. "Battle stations," Cale said calmly, as if this was no different than any other fight. His crew snapped into action, clinging to his steadiness like a lifeline. Across the ship, weapons powered up, shields hummed to life, and damage control teams readied themselves for the inevitable storm. The enemy did not waste time. Their first volley struck like a hammer, slamming into Invictus's shields, shaking the ship to her core. The deck trembled, sparks flew, alarms wailed. Engineers shouted over comms as they scrambled to stabilize the systems. Cale gave no sign of panic. "Return fire," he ordered. The dreadnought roared back, unleashing her cannons in every direction, missiles streaking into the void. One enemy cruiser erupted in flames, torn apart by the unexpected ferocity of her guns. But for every enemy destroyed, 5 more closed in. The trap tightened, the circle shrinking, the storm pressing harder and harder. On the bridge, the crew fought with everything they had. Rena shouted firing solutions. Malik screamed updates from engineering. Dorian relayed orders with trembling hands. The ship shuddered under blow after blow, hull plating tearing, corridors flooding with smoke. Medics carried the wounded through narrow halls as the battle raged on, their faces pale but determined. Still, Invictus did not yield. She turned sharply, charging at the weakest section of the enemy line, guns blazing, engines burning hot enough to shake themselves apart. It was a desperate gamble, but Cale knew hesitation was death. The dreadnought slammed through the formation, ripping holes in the enemy's ranks, forcing them to scatter for just a moment. That moment was enough to remind everyone watching why humanity still fought. But the trap was not so easily broken. More ships closed in, their weapons pounding mercilessly. Fires erupted on the lower decks. Entire sections went dark. Cale could hear the strain in every report. Shields failing. Starboard turrets offline. Hull breaches in sectors 9 through 12. Each word cut deeper into his heart, but he showed no weakness. The crew looked to him, and so he stood tall, his voice calm even as destruction closed around them. "We hold. No matter what comes, we hold." The enemy pressed harder, determined to erase the legend of Invictus. But the dreadnought fought like a beast cornered, her crew refusing to surrender. Every strike they made carried the weight of all humanity. Every shot was not just for survival, but for every colony lost, every fleet destroyed, every life stolen. Outside, the void was filled with fire. Inside, the ship shook with the will of her people. Against impossible odds, Invictus endured. She did not fall. Not yet. When the battle reached its peak, Cale knew they stood on the edge of destruction. The enemy had numbers, firepower, and the trap. But what they did not have was the heart of a crew that refused to die. And as long as that heart kept beating, the last dreadnought of humanity would not break. The battle in the Myro system had turned into a storm of fire and steel. The trap had been sprung, and Invictus was surrounded by more ships than any sane commander would dare face. Yet still she fought. Her guns roared with fury, tearing through enemy cruisers and ripping apart the traps laid against her. But for every enemy ship destroyed, 2 more replaced it, and the noose around her neck grew tighter. Smoke filled her corridors. The lights flickered as power surged and failed. Entire decks had been sealed off because of fires and breaches. Men and women bled at their stations, refusing to leave, holding controls with trembling hands as if their touch alone could keep the dreadnought alive. Kale stood in the center of the bridge, his uniform burned and bloodied, his voice steady. His crew clung to that voice. Every order he gave was like a lifeline pulled from the abyss. "Redirect power to the forward shields," he commanded. "Keep the engines burning. We don't stop moving." The dreadnought surged forward, tearing through the heart of the enemy formation like a wounded predator. Her cannons spat death, her engines howled, and even as enemy fire ripped into her armor, she refused to fall silent. The galaxy's last human warship fought like a titan, and her enemies, though countless, were forced to respect her. But respect did not stop their fire. Missiles struck her hull. Plasma tore across her side. A colossal explosion ripped through her starboard wing, tearing it open like paper. The ship screamed in agony, alarms blaring across every deck. In engineering, Malik shouted as flames erupted. His hands burned from trying to stabilize the reactor. In medical bays, doctors worked with blood-stained gloves, whispering encouragement to soldiers who knew they might never rise again. Still, no one gave up. Every person aboard knew what this meant. They were not fighting to win. They were fighting to show the galaxy that humanity's spirit could not be broken. If Invictus fell, she would fall as a symbol, one final act of defiance that would echo across the stars. Kale's voice was calm, but his eyes burned with fire. "We hold this line," he said. "We show them what it means to face humanity." The crew roared in answer, their voices strong even in the face of death. Their unity gave the ship one last surge of life. For hours the battle raged. Enemy ships came at them in waves, but Invictus refused to be crushed. Her guns shredded battleships, her missiles tore holes in carriers, her point defense systems cut down swarms of fighters. The battlefield became a graveyard of burning wreckage, a testament to her defiance. But she was bleeding. Her shields flickered and died. Her armor was cracked and broken. Fires raged uncontrollably in the lower decks. Entire sections had gone silent, their crews lost in the chaos. The dreadnought was dying, but she was dying on her own terms. The enemy commanders grew desperate. This single human ship had already destroyed more of their fleet than entire armadas had before. They knew they had to end it. The largest of their battleships, a massive flagship bristling with weapons, moved in to finish the fight. Its guns lit up, pouring fire into Invictus, pounding her until the hull groaned and metal screamed. Kale watched the tactical screen, his mind racing. He knew this was the end, but he also knew the end could matter. Slowly, he turned to his crew, his voice low but steady. "We're not going to survive this," he said. But survival was never the point. We are the last shield of humanity. If this ship falls, it falls as a message that no matter how many fleets they crush, humanity will never kneel. His words spread like fire. Across the ship, broken soldiers smiled through blood. Engineers worked with renewed fury. Gunners lined up their final shots. Everyone knew what they were about to do. Kale gave the final order. All power to weapons. Target their flagship. If we're going down, we take their heart with us. The engines screamed as every reserve of energy was poured into the guns. The dreadnought turned toward the massive enemy battleship, her broken hull glowing red with the heat of her fury. For one moment, the battlefield fell silent, as if even the void itself held its breath. Then Invictus roared. Her cannons fired with every last ounce of strength, unleashing a storm of fire so bright it lit the wreckage-strewn system. The first barrage smashed through the enemy's shields. The second tore into its armor. The third gutted it completely, ripping the massive warship apart in a chain of fiery explosions that shook the stars. The enemy flagship died, and with it the enemy's certainty. But the price was everything. The dreadnought shuddered violently, her core failing, her systems collapsing one by one. The lights dimmed, fires raged unchecked, and the once proud warship groaned like a dying beast. On the bridge, Kale stood tall, his eyes on the burning wreckage of the enemy flagship. "We did it," Rena whispered through tears, her voice trembling. Kale nodded slowly. "No, you did it. Humanity did it." The ship shook one last time, and Invictus drifted silently among the wreckage. She had fought her last battle, but she had done what no one else could. She had stood alone, against the impossible, and she had left a mark on history that would never be erased. The last dreadnought of humanity had made her stand, and the galaxy would never forget it. The wreckage of the battle floated silently in the Myros system. Shattered ships, twisted metal, and drifting bodies spun slowly in the cold emptiness of space. The war was over, but no one could look at the battlefield and think of victory. What remained was not triumph, but a graveyard. And at the center of it drifted the broken body of Invictus, the last dreadnought of humanity. Her hull was torn open in 100 places. Fires had burned out, leaving only scars of blackened steel. Her mighty cannons, once so fierce, were silent forever. She was a ghost now, a giant tomb drifting among the stars. Yet even in her silence, she radiated power. To every eye that looked upon her, she was not a defeated ship. She was a monument. The enemy fleets that had come to crush her hung back now, hesitant. They had destroyed humanity's last warship, yes, but at a cost that shook them to their core. One ship, alone, had slain dozens of their vessels, including their great flagship. One ship had stood against an entire armada and refused to fall quietly. That kind of defiance was not something easily forgotten, nor easily explained. Whispers spread among the surviving enemy crews. They spoke of the humans with fear and with awe. For years, the galaxy had dismissed humanity as weak, scattered, and desperate. But Invictus had proven otherwise. She had shown the galaxy the raw fire that burned in human hearts, the will to fight even when all hope was gone. The enemy captains who returned home could not escape those whispers. They carried them across the stars like a plague of doubt. Meanwhile, word of the battle traveled faster than any fleet. Traitors, smugglers, spies. Everyone who heard the tale carried it onward. And with every retelling, the story grew stronger. It was said that the dreadnought fought until her guns melted from heat, that she destroyed entire fleets in minutes, that her captain never wavered, never feared, and met death with a smile. People who had never seen Earth, who had never spoken to a human, found themselves moved by the story. Across the galaxy, oppressed species under alien rule began to whisper, "If one human ship can do this, what could humanity achieve if they rise again?" In the shattered remains of Earth's colonies, survivors listened too. They had believed themselves broken, beaten, abandoned. But now they heard that Invictus had fought for them until her last breath. They heard that Captain Kale and his crew had not surrendered, had not begged, but had fought until their enemies burned. For the first time in years, hope flickered in their hearts. Children on ruined worlds repeated the story in hushed voices. Soldiers hiding in the shadows raised their heads with new pride. Scientists, workers, farmers. All of them looked to the stars and whispered the same thing. We are not finished. Humanity still stands. On alien worlds, fear grew in the hearts of rulers. The council that had once mocked and exiled humans now faced a new problem. They could not erase what had happened. Too many had seen. Too many had heard. The story of Invictus was spreading faster than any decree they could issue. And with every passing day, it became harder to convince their people that humanity was weak. Instead, humans became a symbol, not just for themselves, but for every race that had been crushed, enslaved, or silenced. People began painting the crest of Invictus on their walls. They sang songs about her battles. They spoke the names of her crew like prayers. Humanity had lost a ship, but gained immortality in the hearts of billions. In the quiet of the wreckage, Invictus drifted on, her torn body untouched. No one dared approach her, not even to claim the remains. She had become sacred ground. Some said they could still hear her engines echoing faintly in the void, as if the ship itself refused to die completely. Others believed her spirit watched over the galaxy, waiting for the day humanity would return in force. Years later, when new human fleets would rise again from the ashes, they would paint the name Invictus on their ships. They would carry her memory into battle, knowing she had shown them the path. The dreadnought had not simply died. It had lit a fire that could never be extinguished. Captain Cale's words, spoken in the ship's final hours, spread far beyond the battle. "We are the last shield of humanity," he had said. "And if we fall as a message, that no matter how many fleets they crush, humanity will never kneel." Those words were remembered long after the wreckage had faded. They were etched into stone, whispered in secret, and carried into every rebellion that followed. So while the dreadnought's body lay silent, her spirit grew louder. She became more than a warship. She became a legend, and legends do not die.